I'm going to, again, just introduce our panelists so that you have a sense of who we'll be speaking with today. To my immediate left is Walt Hunter, who's the chair of the English department. Next to him is Kim Emmons, who's the Oviatt professor and associate professor in the English department. Next to Kim is Martha Wilson Schaefer, senior instructor and associate director of composition. And next to Martha is Anya Mathis, who's an undergraduate student majoring in biomedical engineering. Please give them a round of applause and welcome them to the event today. Thank you. So what are we trying to accomplish with this particular panel? Because we could go on lots of different journeys and paths with this particular topic, and there's been lots written about it recently. So what we're going to be focusing on today is just a really brief overview of the technology. We're going to talk a little bit about perspectives from each of the panelists, from a broad perspectives all the way down to conversations that are happening with students in real time on our campus. And then we'll have some constructive ideas to share with you all at the end of the session. On the table in front of you, there are some handouts which you are welcome to take with you, and on the back of the handout is a QR code that links you to resources, some of which will be referenced during our conversations today, but that gives you some digital access to materials as well. Well, let's dive in. What is ChatGPT? Well, let's ask the expert, which is exactly what I did. I logged into my free account for ChatGPT, and the prompt that I gave was, what is ChatGPT? And the response that you see is up here, and I'll read it briefly. ChatGPT, Generative Pre-trained Transformer, is a large language model developed by OpenAI. It is based on the transformer architecture, which is a type of deep neural network that can process sequential data such as natural language text. ChatGPT is trained on a massive amount of text data using an unsupervised learning method. This means that it does not require explicit labeling or supervision to learn patterns in the data. Instead, it learns to generate text by predicting the next word in a sequence of words given the preceding context. As a result of its training, ChatGPT has the ability to generate coherent and contextually relevant text, which makes it useful for a variety of natural language processing tasks, such as text completion, machine translation, and text summarization. It can also be used for conversational AI applications where it can engage in human-like conversation with users. This automated response was generated on March 3rd, 2023, and I got a different response prior to that was a little bit shorter, and the one that I got just the other day that I can't show because now it's too busy to talk to me, which happens sometimes, was longer. So it is adapting, it is kind of learning from the different prompts that are coming up, but the big idea is that it's just what it explains. It is a device that is going back and looking at resources. There are limitations to it. There are some implications that we should consider. So let's think about those limitations for just 1 second. Okay. The Center for Research in Teaching and Learning at the University of Michigan is one of our peer institutions in terms of a teaching and learning center, and this is what they offered in terms of limitations. While it does particularly well with generative responses based on the prompts, the responses are limited to the prompts that it receives. And it is learning. It's picking up on the prompts as they go. Some of them are more appropriate for academic settings, and some of them are probably less appropriate for academic settings. But all of that is going into the machine, into the technology, into the AI. It is unable to access the material beyond firewalls like JSTOR, as an example, within the academic context that we're in. And it really is only reaching back to material of 2021 or earlier. And a quote from one of the psychology professors at University of Michigan, I'll share, while ChatGPT does particularly well with very general prompts, such as contrast capitalism and socialism, few professors ask students to write papers on broad questions like that, and the more you make the question like something a student might get, narrow and focused on a specific course-related content, the worse ChatGPT performs. This professor also says that he gave ChatGPT a question about the relationship between language and color perception that he asked his third-year psychology language class, and, quote, it bombed, end quote. So there are limitations with what it will do. What are some of the implications then that we might be thinking about? Back in February, on the 16th, Daniel Salcido, who is a director of simulation and ed technology at the Mount Sinai Simulation Center, this is in the HEC on our campus, had a couple of points that he shared in a presentation where he really focused more on the technology and what the technology was and wasn't, which we won't be doing that so much today. And 2 points that stood out for me that I thought I would reiterate are that what we need to be maybe thinking about is the fact that it's going to continue to develop. We've already talked a little bit about that it's learning from the prompts that it's receiving. And it also will become more widespread as people continue to access it. And I shared with you a little bit earlier that I tried to get on it so I could show you some live interactions today, and it's busy. So more and more people are signing up for the free accounts, and it does reach capacity, and it will tell you that we can't talk to you right now in a polite way. Another point that I think that is important for any kind of working with assistive technology, teaching and learning methodologies need to evolve and change. And learning and technologies will continue to evolve and change. We had a panel at a First Friday event for USITE at the beginning of March. And one of our students, who is actually here with us today, gave a great quote, and I loved it so much that I put it on a slide. And that is, we really need to be thinking about this because the toothpaste is already out of the tube, and it's not going to end up back in there. So what are things that we might think about in terms of ways to engage students with this technology, and specifically within the context today for our panel with academic writing? And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Walt.
Thanks, Matthew, and thanks to everybody for being here. I come fresh from my office where I just got a call from a judge out in Provo, Utah, who was running a poetry contest. I'm not sure why a judge was running a poetry contest, but that was a question I didn't ask. And ChatGPT had won the poetry contest. It was a high school poetry contest. So you can imagine he was pretty dismayed about this and wanted to know if he should end the poetry contest because of it. I thought this was a very interesting question, and I was fully expecting something like this to happen because one of the things that ChatGPT can do is write poetry in a certain sense of that word. And I think, I want to stay kind of positive and optimistic about the uses of really miraculously invented technology, automata. We have an example of a wonderful automaton in the art museum from the 14th century in France. It's a little machine that you pump water through it and it makes music. I don't think anybody says it's the Cleveland Orchestra, though. And I think I want to make a little bit of a difference between the kinds of writing that ChatGPT as an automated machine can produce and the kinds of writing that we teach our students to describe as good or great writing. But first of all, I just want to say a few general things about where the things that ChatGPT produces fit into literature as a whole, or even writing as a whole. And Kim and Martha and Anya will pick up on some of these themes. So the category of literature, when you dial it back centuries, included everything that was written. It was not limited as it is now to fictional writing. And so I think there's a case to be made that we should fit into our understanding of literature the writing that is produced by ChatGPT. That doesn't mean that I think it's Nobel Prize winning writing, but does it count as literature in the sense that it is written material being generated in some form? Well, possibly, or at least that raises an interesting question, I think. When we ask the question, what is literature? It's a provocative question to bat around potentially with our students. And it reminds them that the category of literature once included a variety of things that now we exclude from that category. That means, stuff like memoir or biography that we describe as riveting as a novel. When we describe these non-fictional works as exciting as fictional works, we're already speaking to the fact that today we've narrowed literature to a very small set of things that are mostly fictional in nature. And even our students sometimes will call, say, a poem or a memoir or something, they'll call it by the title of novel, indicating that we have limited our sense of what literature is to a certain kind of writing. And ChatGPT challenges us to expand that category of literature a bit. I'm trying to be a little optimistic here. I'll say a few more pessimistic things towards the end. So there's a challenge here to distinguish between good and bad writing. That's always productive for our students to take up. What is a great poem? What makes a great poem? What is a difference between a poem that ChatGPT writes about socks and one that Seamus Heaney writes about the death of his mother? These kinds of questions can emerge when we're comparing essentially something produced by ChatGPT to something produced by a Nobel Prize winning Irish laureate. But what are the assumptions, I suppose, that are going unspoken here when we think about ChatGPT? And that's where I have 2 points that I want to make before I hand it over to Kim. One, when we get really concerned, I think, about ChatGPT plagiarizing or producing writing that's mistaken for humans, what we're assuming is that all writing is kind of written from a position that is a universal position, an uncoded position, a position that is oftentimes presented as a white male position when we think about what a universal subject position is. And indeed, I think that questions of race, gender, sexuality, and ability have been troublingly absent from conversations around ChatGPT. Writing is shaped by our experiences and our backgrounds, and how we talk about the metabolization of our experiences and backgrounds in the written word is an important discussion to have, not only with students, but with ourselves as scholars and as critics of literature. Okay, so that's one assumption. The second assumption is that ChatGPT, when we think about with terror how it will reproduce the poems of Seamus Heaney or of Kim Emmons or of Martha Shaver, we assume that all writing is basically value neutral, that it's basically like performing a set of tasks like a grocery list. Or shift it to the essay. We assume that any essay, if it has 5 paragraphs, could be a passable essay. Well, we're actually trying to teach our students that that's not a good kind of writing, what ChatGPT produces. This is tied in a bit to the question of how backgrounds and experiences and voices make their way into essay writing, because as soon as you admit that there are a variety of ways that a student can represent their thoughts on the page in order, then you have to take into account that sometimes those ways that they're doing it are related to their particular experiences as individuals and as members of society at large. So Coleridge called what ChatGPT produces fancy, not imagination. We still think of it, we might think of it as found text as well, words that are shifted around based on the statistical likelihood that they'll fit. So at best, I think that ChatGPT gives us a facsimile of already existing writing, but in terms of what it produces. But the conversations it creates are those that I think do deserve more attention, and I think that's where it really contributes to some of the philosophical discussions about writing that we're having in the classroom and in the dining halls, and as students move quickly into the final exam territory. So I'll hand it over into Kim, just having made those 2 points about the types of writing and assumptions that we make about writing that ChatGPT potentially unearths or exposes.
Thank you. So I want to pick up on the threads. I love your comment that this might be thought of as found text, and I want to pause and say sometimes what we find is not very accurate. Just try asking ChatGPT who you are. I asked it who's Kimberly Emmons at Case Western Reserve, and it gave me some pretty depressing results that bear no resemblance to who I am as a scholar or a person. So it can be kind of amusing or depressing, depending. Okay, is that better? Okay, good. Sorry. And also to underline what Walt just said about questions of diversity, perspective, human experience. So from a writing studies perspective, AI-generated text isn't human. It isn't part of a relationship between a writer and a reader. It can't replicate that. It doesn't talk back to you other than to spit back out its preformed sentences. And it's kind of fun to see what it does. It can produce reasonably clean looking, what I would call standard edited English. So it's following pretty standard grammar rules, for the most part. But that can produce some fairly comical effects, as when it chooses a quotation from Elizabeth Bennet in Pride and Prejudice that was not spoken by Elizabeth Bennet and attributes it to her in service of an argument about her nascent feminist tendencies. At any rate, so it is worth asking the kinds of questions that Walt is asking. I want to also raise 4 questions that I think for teachers of writing, particularly teachers of academic writing, that we might want to pause over and maybe talk some more. I've mused at more length in the resources that Matthew referred to. In the QR code will lead you to a folder where you can also find Walt's excellent Atlantic essay on poetry, on whether or not ChatGPT can win poetry contests, which he'll now be rewriting after his conversation this afternoon. But so my 4 topics quickly, because really Martha and Anya have the most interesting stuff to talk about today. So for scholarship and or educational policy, I think we do need to ask ourselves, why is AI-inspired writing, ChatGPT and all of its cousins, so good at the MCAT? Why is it so good at the GRE, at the SAT? And it's so good at them because those are deeply formulaic quite frankly, boring kinds of writing, right? It can predict some very simple, very surface level kinds of things. And I think we need to ask some questions about, can we finally move away from that form of testing and that form of evaluation? And there, of course, I'm speaking specifically of the writing portions of those tests. I won't comment on the multiple choice portions for now. I think the big question that many of us are asking, or an initial reaction to ChatGPT, is, what about cheating? What if everybody's suddenly going to fool me in my classroom? And I want to take a deep breath and say, of course, that's our first reaction. But remember, too, that the plagiarism detectors of the last generation, that's Turnitin.com, et cetera, really weren't that good either, and that they were biased and that they're unlikely to keep up. There are folks, Senior Theses and others, who are creating AI detection software. And maybe that's an interesting question for us to ask about what assumptions that software makes as it's analyzing text. From my sense of things so far, it's not always particularly good. But I want us as teachers to think about why we might not want to use those tools. And my answer to that is because they interfere in that social relationship between writer and reader. They turn teachers into detectives and judges and juries rather than mentors and facilitators and guides into critical thinking. So I want to steal from our friend and colleague Lisa D'Amour's argument about growing up versus just aging into adulthood, where she says we should think about risk. We should think about risk not as, will I get caught, but what are the actual harms? So transferring that into the classroom, not encouraging our students to worry about getting caught plagiarizing or using AI, but what harms for real are they incurring when they do so? Related to that might be our questions about assessment. So quickly following on the heels of, oh no, what happens if a student turns something in that was generated by ChatGPT, might come my elation that, oh good, maybe I never have to read another essay, which of course is also not true. And I would actually be quite sad if I didn't read essays. But it's been more than 50 years that AI has been promising to do away with first-year composition reading. It's never done it particularly well. And more importantly, again, with that social relationship, it doesn't talk back. It doesn't say to a writer, hey, you just reminded me of that great thing you said in class last week. It doesn't say to a writer, what did you mean here? It just spits out its sort of response. So I think we need to think about, as Walt's suggesting, what kinds of questions might this be raising about the sorts of texts our students and we are producing. But I don't think it's going to take my job anytime soon. And then finally, and I hope this sets up what Martha and Anya want to talk about, but as teachers thinking about assignment design, why are you asking students to write, and what are you asking them to write? So if you are using writing in order to simply assess content knowledge, we may have some hard thinking to do. As Matthew says, these new technologies do make it fairly easy to produce bland definitions. Or I think of back in my day, it was the identification. Which poet from your romantic poetry class said this? These 4 lines. I think AI is probably going to be pretty darn good at identifying that, because it can simply search its memory banks in metaphorical memory banks. It doesn't actually have, as it told me the other day, I'm not human. I can't remember things. But if we want students to develop critical thinking and real engagement and a personal investment, then I don't think we have too much to worry yet about AI writing. But it does bring us back to that question of, what is it that we want students to do? What do we want? What kinds of skills are they demonstrating? What kinds of writing are they doing? So I want to hand this discussion over to Martha and Anya, but I want to reiterate one more time, writing and reading are social interactions. They are part of a relationship that's built in the classroom setting between student and teacher, in the Atlantic between Walt and his readers, et cetera, and I suppose commenters. But they depend on real human creativity and relationship building. So I encourage everybody and myself to have fun with the technology, or scorn it, or make fun of it, or whatever you need to do. but don't let it get in the way of that productive teaching relationship between you and your students.
Do I need to move that over closer? Thanks. Thank you, Kim and Walt and Matthew. Yeah, that teed us up quite nicely, Kim. But I'm also struck as I was listening to Walt pose the question of what is good writing. As a person who works in linguistics and rhetoric and writing studies and a lot of first-year writing, that's a super exciting question to me that I'm always happy to talk to people about. It's a loaded question. There's a lot to it. And I think that something like natural language processing really challenges us to think more deeply about that question. So I actually find this quite exciting. And I've been fortunate enough to have conversations with lots of colleagues in the writing program and outside the writing program about how we can use things like ChatGPT in our classrooms as we're working with students as part of delivering content and knowledge and helping our students to become better writers. I think it's important to think about, what the value of writing is as part of that larger question, and why we're using it. So in my case, I'm often using it to teach students how to write, right? They're developing their writing skills in our first year writing courses, and my interest is different in that vein than perhaps in linguistics, where I'm delivering content and asking students to write so that I can see if they've understood the content, or even to write so that they can synthesize and apply the material that they've been learning. So I think those are two different things. I think they often overlap, but thinking about, what writing gets you in terms of assessment is something that we should be considering when we're thinking about how we use writing for assessment purposes. And I think that it also really interesting to me, particularly this semester, as I've talked to my linguistics students about these kind of tools, I spent the first 6 weeks of linguistics explaining to them how predictive and constrained writing is, or speaking and our use of language is. It only operates because we have pretty predictable rules about how we produce sounds and words and sentences and then whole contexts out of language. So it's interesting to think about what that reveals to us about the way we read the writing that our students produce for us, and how much of writing is very predictable. And that's how ChatGPT learns. That's how natural language processing works. It looks and it sees all of the text that we're generating, and it's statistical, it's predictable. That's great, but that's not the part of writing that's exciting to us, the people who are teaching writing, and I suspect even the people who are using writing in assessment contexts. What we're interested in is not the constraint part that the machine's really, really good at, maybe even better than us at, because it always knows where the comma goes, but the creativity, right? And that's what we talked about in linguistics, is that language is rule-based creativity, and it's the creative piece. It's the how are you synthesizing these things? How are you relating these things to your own experiences? How are you thinking about one thing we talked about one day and some other perspective that was brought in another day? So that's the kind of content in the writing, the stuff in the writing that I think is really interesting. And what Anya and I are going to talk about today is how our colleagues and ourselves have participated in this project of kind of teaching with, about, around ChatGPT and what will eventually be its more skilled progeny. They just released ChatGPT 4, I think, and the New York Times ran an article this morning about Bard, which is Google's version of this thing that they claim they have ethically and slowly unrolled so that it can't do bad stuff. But ultimately, it's going to do the same kind of stuff. So I think like at an entry level, one thing you can do with students that's pretty productive that I did myself, and we really had a good and unpredictable conversation about it in linguistics, was we just talked about it. We read an article about it. Some of the students didn't know what it was, had never seen it before. Others were like, oh yeah, I used this, or oh yeah, my roommate used this. Oh yeah, my friend at this university wrote a paper with it. So it was a really interesting conversation just to kind of hear their experiences of it. But also their attitudes about it came out pretty quickly. They weren't like, oh, this is awesome, I'm going to cheat with this. They were like, this is terrible. And if somebody gave me a poem and I found out it was written by artificial intelligence, I would be offended to my core as a human being. So it was fun to just have that conversation. But there's lots of conversations, regardless of what your
teaching discipline is, to have about this. There's labor concerns about what this is going to do to industries. There's material concerns. There's accessibility concerns. I heard a great panel a couple weeks ago at a conference in Chicago about concerns about privacy. Here we're all in it, screwing around in it, giving it information, teaching it our ways, right? Making it better at being us. And nobody's read the privacy policy in the document. I was in a room of hundreds of people, and the speaker said, "Has anybody gone over the privacy policy in OpenAI with their students?" And one hand went up. So I think there's lots of stuff there. There's ethics, there's labor, there's culture, there's what is good writing, and how do we feel about it. So that's just a first level, just conversations. It also lets students know that you know about it, which I think is also a good thing, because that way they'd be more likely to come with you with questions about it or want to talk about it and think about it. Another thing that many of my colleagues have done quite successfully is kind of thought about what it is that they're asking students to do in the writing. Like, what is this prompt? What does this prompt look like? Like Kim said, compare and contrast this and this. That's the thing a machine could do. That's not a real exciting thing for a student to do. But asking them, if you were the administrator of a hospital and somebody presented you with this problem, how would you solve that, right? So thinking about, the kinds of thinking, the kind of cognitive activity that you are trying to prompt the students to do through the writing, with the writing, and paying attention to how your prompt helps them get at things like critical thinking, analysis, ethical deliberation. It's because it's not great with understanding, it's not great with reasoning, and it is not great with creativity. A third thing, if you're thinking in terms of writing assessment, that some of my colleagues and I have done is we put our prompt in to see what ChatGPT wrote. What would you do with this prompt, ChatGPT? And asked it a question. And you see it kind of tests the prompt. Like, is this prompt doing the things or prompting my students to do the things that I want them to be doing with this writing? And then thinking about, what that response looks like, and thinking about how you read the responses to your work. I think we probably all, those of us who give writing prompts, think about, as we're reading them, like, oh, this prompt, I need to change this aspect of this prompt because students were misunderstanding this. ChatGPT is a good tool for that as well. The other thing that I've seen people do, and that I have done in my classroom, particularly with my first year writers, is we talk about rhetorical situations. Kim talked about the fact that this is a relationship, right, between a reader and a writer. So we talk about the reader, the writer, the context, the constraints of the context, purpose, persuasion, all of those things. And it was interesting to ask it, to give it changing parameters around who the audience was for something, who the speaker was in a particular case, and to look and see how ChatGPT understood the rhetorical situation changing. And then that led to our own conversations about, well, if I was writing this to this audience, they would know X, Y, and Z, or they would understand this, or they would bring this preconceived notion that I would expect them to have to the writing. And so to think about it kind of as a social act and behavior in the world, and not just words and grammatically correct sentences on a page. So I think that in many ways, this reveals to us how much of language is routine, how much of it is predictable, how much we rely on communication to communicate with each other on a daily basis. That's what it can do. That's what it's really good at. I can easily see it being helpful in a myriad of ways in my day-to-day job of getting all the copious amounts of text generated that I need to get generated. But that's not really the interesting part of writing. If ChatGPT can be really good at grammar and really good at sentence structure and really good at paragraphing, then we don't need to ask our students. We don't need to read our students for those things, right? That can help them get that done, and then they can get on to the creative, the imaginative, the synthesizing, the critical thinking, the ethical deliberating that we hope that they're doing through the language. Because I think it's easy in many cases to confuse cognitive processing with language production. And though they are very, very deeply intertwined, they are not exactly the same thing. And it's very easy to be distracted by a poorly written essay that's full of great ideas, and as easy to be mesmerized by a really well-written essay that isn't full of any ideas. I will, I'm going to turn things over to Anya, and she's going to talk about some experiences she has had from the student perspective of using ChatGPT in the classroom.
was close enough. I don't know. Good. Thank you. Yes, I am here to kind of give a student perspective on ChatGPT, the general attitude towards it. So, like many other students, I think I only started considering ChatGPT as an academic resource when my professors started bringing it up as such. I'm going to give an example from my Sages class, taught by Professor Byrne. So, okay. We had an assignment to write an analysis about a chosen children's picture book and like pitch it to a elementary school teacher. We all had our different books, different approaches and whatnot. We came into class a day after the due date, and we were handed a peer written paper to grade based off of the same rubric that we had been given. The catch was that it was written by ChatGPT in response to the prompt. While there were some things readily suspicious about it, such as it was only 5 paragraphs long instead of 6 pages, we did note that it had very fluid grammar, like surface level examples of books, and it had a readily evident thesis. It was very ordinary, very basic, and it was just overall a fine essay. Nothing too deep, nothing too interesting about it. This was not done to discourage us from using ChatGPT, but rather to just see that it is capable of writing a fine essay and give students ideas about like how to format an essay. No one was entirely surprised that it was written by ChatGPT, but it was pretty interesting. Since then, I've kind of started to question how ChatGPT can be used as a resource for writing itself. It does have a way of, with its really large database, it can bring up some very good counter arguments that could be encountered in writing that you might not have thought about initially. It can bring a lot of nuance to a paper just to ask it some questions about the topic and then go off and do your own research based off of what you find. It's not necessarily there to just tell you about or write your essay for you. You can utilize it in other ways. I think about it a lot as like how I would treat a calculator during a math test. Like, it can formulate your sentences for you. It can help you out with that and just really deliver a clear, concise idea that you want to be heard, but may not necessarily know how to convey. And that brings me to accessibility. Especially at college, universities, we have all of these resources of internet, we have Google accounts, we have all of these resources at our disposal, and villainizing or discouraging the use of ChatGPT or other OpenAI is doing a serious disservice to the resources that we have. We have Sages classes about so many different things. Children's picture books, fly fishing. There's a lot, really. And I think the value of teaching students about this resource and how to use it in a way that isn't just asking it for answers could be really valuable to students. A lot of my friends will use this OpenAI chat to ask it about algorithms or code, and even in those cases, ChatGPT does have flaws, and they readily recognize that, but it does give you a good point to start. If you're working on something in the middle of the night, it's not necessarily going to be in your best interest to email a TA because they will not see it until the next day. But ChatGPT is pretty readily available, even if you do have to wait for a little while in the line. I personally, ChatGPT, I'm using it to help me with my final research project in my Sages class, which is a comprehensive research paper on mental illnesses present in children's books, and I have used it to generate resources of books that address this issue, and it has like very greatly aided me in my search. It's difficult to know where to start with something like that. And even though we do have access to these huge databases with CASE that have all of these papers and whatnot, sometimes it's really difficult to type in those 4 keywords and find exactly what you're looking for. But when you ask ChatGPT in a sentence, like, can you give me a list of children's books that address mental illnesses? It will pop up with a very constructive list of books that address your exact topic. So I really see ChatGPT as a launching point for education, and it might just help students get a grasp of how to start things. It isn't doing the work for them. It's just expediting the process of finding these resources, getting these ideas, and then putting everything together in a cohesive way that will be interesting to read and will allow more students to be heard. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you all for those perspectives. I think it's very helpful to hear from faculty who have administrative roles within the English department in particular, as well as other ideas in terms of ethics and implications that might be had in terms of the process and humanization of writing. I love that we heard a number of times this idea of why are we using writing? What is the goal? How does it align with what we're trying to accomplish with our students? How does it align with our learning objectives? How does it align as an assessment tool? Is it really the best way to accomplish what we're trying to do? And I think that's a great kind of grounding way to think about it. And I loved Anya's idea of maybe using it as a launching point, but having the conversation with students about what are ways that you might engage with it. What are helpful ways to use it? What are things maybe that aren't going to be as helpful to you? And I would echo that. I mean, it is a fantastic, what's a good policy for blank? It will generate a lot of stuff from before 2021 on what a good way to write a policy is, which is helpful because it saves time, but it does require then to go back and refine that language within specific context. And again, coming back to the human element to convey those ideas. Well, we want to make this not just a panel discussion up here, but also a panel discussion with you all as well. We've got a variety of students, I think, in the room and faculty in the room. And we wanted to have some time to kind of hear from you. What are ways that you have engaged with it? What are some questions that you might have specifically related, again, within writing context? What are some thoughts that you have about using the technology or not? And I would welcome you to kind of join us over here at the mic that you see over on the right-hand side of the room, and we'll respond accordingly. So I want to turn this back over into our group that's assembled today. What are some questions and concerns that you might have? What's on your mind? I see Peter's coming up, and then Timothy, please join afterwards.
Thank you. I'm interested in the issue of reflexivity and recursiveness of ChatGPT based on 2 historical events in AI. When IBM Watson debated a British debater, actually the audience judged that they learned more from the computer, even though the human debater won the debate. The idea that the computer had to listen because it was, make your argument, rebuttal, make your argument, rebuttal. The other was when AlphaGo basically wiped out humans because they started playing each other. And so in chess, of course, it's patterns. So the computer plays itself or another variant, then back and back and back. So they got better by essentially playing with each other. So do you see ChatGPT having a future in having conversations with itself?
Well, maybe, again, you can speak to just what you've experienced up to this point. So I think that one of the fun things about the discussion is that we don't have all the answers. It's new tech, and we're all in the process of learning as good educators anyway. But if you all have some things maybe from your experience that might relate to what Peter's asking about.
If not, I'll ask ChatGPT.
I do. Oh, yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead.
So I guess it's
Join us at the mic if you don't mind, and if you'd introduce yourself, that would be wonderful.
Hi everyone. Okay, is this good?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi everyone. My name's Jared Kokonos. I'm a undergraduate senior majoring in statistics, and so kind of what immediately comes to mind with that question is that as it's as it's like learning and kind of processing all these different coding languages, part of me wonders if it's going to optimize those languages and kind of just create its own language that's already been optimized given like all the best parameters of Python or R, and kind of just figure like, well, maybe that's not like the most effective way to write a package, and like kind of just come up with like base functions that, instead of having to like worry about downloading these packages that are open source, and like now is it a like security issue if like we're running a program that we don't know who's actually developed it. Part of me wonders like, oh well, like is that maybe for the best? So yeah, thank you.
Maybe ChatGPT will invent another language and replace English.
Possibly. Peter, your question makes me think. So I'm still playing around with ChatGPT. I did ask it what might a peer say about this essay you've just composed for me on the character analysis of Elizabeth Bennet, which was a not great essay. And it said, I'm an AI, I can't do peer review, but here's some things that this essay might do better. And it proceeded with a few bullet points of fairly bland, incorporate more evidence and do something on. It was not a great peer review, probably not anywhere close to what you and your peers could say about the essay. So I'm not too worried yet that it will be teaching the whole class both sides of the desk for us. But I'm curious about to what extent our chats are stored and remembered in that. I mean, memory in this case is a metaphor, but thinking about that, what do you think?
Yeah. So I think this goes back to machine learning, and something else I have found interesting. I'm going to bring up the example of facial recognition. There is a lot of controversy about that because of the bias that it is created with. It is coded by a very specific group of people, predominantly white men that are computer science majors. And therefore, the code has this like inherent bias to it. And that is just something to be aware of. It was not necessarily coded with that in mind, but that is how it resulted because of its testing base. I think what makes ChatGPT different is that all of these AI open chats are public. They are gathering information from more than just one subset of people, but it does skew to the people who have access to the internet or have access to these resources. So while that might be a concern, I think the best way to address it is to inform people of potential biases. Like, if it is machine learning and it's just debating itself, it will eventually come to a conclusion that reflects that of the predominant demographic that is using it. So it's something to be mindful of and maybe push to have it be exposed to more than just the people who have access readily available to them.
Comes back to the idea that I think Walt mentioned as well about the ethics, the broader implications, and understanding that it is learning from everybody who engages with it, and people may have different motives when they go to make that initial engagement. So it's learning from people who might be like-minded with us and people who are going to be approaching it from a very different perspective as well. There are some of the things that are on the resources, both on the hard copy of the handout on the back that Martha helped to compile, and some of the things that we've pulled from other teaching pedagogy articles and practitioner kind of online journals that are available on the digital handout speak to that, go into this idea of how to have conversations with students about the ethical implications, understanding that we are continually feeding and helping the technology to kind of learn and advance as it goes through. Okay, Timothy, I want to come to you.
Thank you. Timothy Wutrick from the Department of Classics. Thank you for this panel. I think it's very helpful. I hope the conversation will continue. I have one observation and two questions. The observation had to do with predictability. And some of you talked about how the ChatGPT can predict things. And as you were saying this, I've just come back from a study abroad trip with our students to Greece. And one of the things we found ourselves doing, especially with the philology students, is looking at fragments of inscriptions. And I'm thinking, gosh, if it can predict what's missing, if you can teach the computer ancient Greek and an inflected language, then that might be a useful application, one that would be good. But it's relatively short and pointed in its use. That's the observation. The questions are to comments that Kim and Anya made. Kim was talking about academic writing and was suggesting that argumentative writing is something that the ChatGPT can't do very well, anything creative and imaginative. And that's, I suppose, a good thing for us because we can encourage our students to write more imaginative essays and so on. But I would push back against one thing, and that's the whole descriptive writing thing. And there are times we say that that's a lower type of writing, a lower level or whatever, but I think probably there's a use for that. I know especially in survey courses, it's useful to have questions that encourage students to remember facts. And that's still a very important part of writing. So I'm wondering, how can we deal with ChatGPT and still have these basic questions on exams? I guess one way would be to bring back blue books, and we do that. But if you're requiring a 200 level course with 50 people in it to survey, say, British literature or Greek literature, how can you do that and be reasonably sure without being a detective all the time, as you say? How can you do that? So that's one question for you. The one for Anya has to do with ChatGPT used to start research. And while I guess that's a good thing, we can still do that with the basic tools that are out there anyways. Just plug something into Google, and ask it, and it'll generate stuff. You can go to JSTOR and do that. And I'm wondering, at what level is this something that we should still be encouraging people to think about rather than machines? Part of the fun in the old days was going into the library and stumbling through the bookshelves or the card catalog or picking up a journal and finding the article that you wanted, but then turning the page and seeing, oh, I didn't read this one. I wasn't even looking for it. It's there. This is pretty cool. So how do you balance between using it as a tool and cutting out an important part of the thinking process, which is learning how to generate questions?
Do you want to start? I'm happy to think a little.
Yeah.
So obviously, fabulous questions and important ones. And I too had a little chill when you were talking about using it as a research tool, and I quickly wrote down we need to talk to our colleagues at KSL about how we're teaching those processes of research. It's not that it's a wrong thing to do. It's just, what are those implications? And I want to underscore on that level, Anya, what you said a moment ago about questions of diversity and questions of representation in what ChatGPT. It's a way of feeding you things that's a little opaque. You don't know where they're coming from, and it is likely to be. I was saying something really profound.
Switch.
Sorry.
Well,
Perhaps too many microphones.
that one's slapstick very well.
Yeah, see, humor. I haven't at my house at the dinner table. We like to ask Siri to tell us a joke, but they're always really pretty bad. I don't know if ChatGPT is any better at them. Maybe I should try. So I just want to underscore again with the mic what Anya was saying a minute ago about diversity, perspective. When we use ChatGPT, we don't know for sure what it's representing or what it's bringing back to us, and it's likely to start. Peter, when you were asking earlier, what came to mind was an echo chamber of, a limited number of thoughts getting thought repeatedly, as opposed to the beauty of human creativity is the perspective that we weren't expecting, I suppose. But that's not what you asked, Timothy. You asked me about descriptive writing, and I didn't mean to denigrate it in any way, because of course it's important. We do, I think, as teachers have to ask when and where and how we ask for writing that is descriptive. So the take-home test that asks for a litany of biological terms with definitions, that was easy to look up on Wikipedia before ChatGPT. I'm not sure ChatGPT adds anything new to that potential equation. But I think it does suggest to us ChatGPT is quite bad at anything personal, any sort of connection to your personal life or your personal experiences. So you define this term and then apply it to that painting we looked at yesterday. It's not going to be able to do those kinds of things. So combining some of those other kinds of definitional or descriptive or other kinds of writing tasks with attaching them to that personal experience, I think is maybe a really interesting opportunity anyway, because it might make it more fun too, right? To connect maybe more personally with some of those things.
I would suggest also that gets into the critical thinking that a number of you have referenced. When we get into the application portion of using that retrieval and recall cognitive functions, and we're going back and looking at procedural knowledge, I would argue that, as an example with revised Bloom's taxonomy, now we're getting into application. Now we're getting into analysis, evaluation, synthesis, creativity. So we are kind of leaning into that space that would get to that critical thinking.
Hold the mic over to yourself too.
Yes, I can. I don't think this one's working too well. This is the one that we swapped. Okay, great. Excellent. Critical thinking is good. Back to you, Kim.
Over to Anya.
Does this mic work? I don't know.
That was
Okay, cool.
I know this one's on.
Okay.
Tell her you said.
Yes, I do agree that only using ChatGPT as a way to generate your resources is going to be highly skewed, in the same way that using any one particular resource is going to be skewed to a degree. One of my recent classes with my Sages class was at KSL with a faculty member talking to us about various resources that we have, which included JSTOR, the KSL Discover page, Google Scholar, and she posed a question to us of whether any of us were using ChatGPT and how we were using it. So it was a relatively new topic for her as well. I personally believe it might be a little bit unfair to criticize ChatGPT as as a way to generate resources, just because it's just another way to find those. There's nothing inhibiting people from going to KSL in person or doing more extensive research on their own. It's just a launching point for thinking about something. And I think that's something important to remember with any discussion relating to ChatGPT, and it's that it's not the only resource. And one of my beliefs is that a main goal should be to just encourage using a plethora of resources and not just one. Because if a student is only using JSTOR to generate resources, they're going to run into similar resources that peers have used already. It's not expanding too much on any certain topic. And I would argue that ChatGPT can generate some things that you might not find otherwise, just because it is a little bit random. It will give you many resources and not just one. It can also be that, like, oh, I didn't mean to find this article, but I'm glad I did. It does provide a little bit of that as well. I just think it's important to stress that there are many resources, and this is just another one to add on. It's not a replacement, and it's not like the be-all, end-all. It just is another way to gather facts or papers, articles, books to start a project, just as JSTOR would be if you didn't have access to ChatGPT.
In the last few minutes that we have, I want to bring a question back from the first Friday event that we had. A participant raised afterwards, and that is, speaking about research. If we get to a place where we are, we're at the stage now where we're beginning our careers as graduate students or postdocs, and I'm co-authoring with a number of other people. How do I do my due diligence to make sure that the document that's been co-authored is going to represent, authentic writing, and that somebody on the team did not use this in a way that was inappropriate? And I wonder if you all have any suggestions or comments about How do you deal with that as one of those co-authors, as somebody trying to get their name started in a field? And it might just be with plagiarism in general, right?
I'm laughing just because we're so. Hello. I'm laughing because we're so bad at certain wings of the discipline, including where I sit at co-authoring. Period. So but I know Kim and Martha have done a lot of co-authoring. And has this question. What do you think?
I will simply say it's still my earlier comments about a social relationship apply, and that know your co-authors, obviously, making sure that you're all talking about the writing process. I have not published in the sciences where I think it's more common for you to take this section and I'll take this section, or to be listed as a co-author and never having written really a sentence of the piece. I think that does raise some important questions that need to be talked about. And I think a lot of journals are working on policies about whether they will accept or not accept, whether one should credit or not credit AI generated text. But again, it comes back to the important questions that Martha was asking us to ask, which is, what are we using the writing for? What is it good for? And there may be, certain kinds of very formulaic description of a particular kind of test that's basically boilerplate now, and that whether or not ChatGPT composed it is still probably not my words. I don't know that we necessarily need a new description of synthesis of X chemical. I'm way out of my field now. Unless you've done something unique with it. So I guess it's a difficult question. It's a social question. It's an ethical question. It's an authorship question. But I would still come back to that. What are we trying to do with the writing? What is the piece of writing doing? I'm not sure if that's satisfying. Do you have a?
I think I'm going to go back to my office and collaborate on an article with ChatGPT.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting it's interesting that ChatGPT is engaging with its human counterparts in what is called conversation, right? That's built right into that word, that this is some sort of social interaction among social language using beings, in a sense of community. So I think it's interesting. It also, a lot of what everybody's saying is also made me think about intertextuality and the fact that most things have already been written in some form or another, and we're just borrowing snippets that we read somewhere or saw somewhere or heard somewhere and recombining them in our own way. But I guess that, the thing that I would think about in terms of worrying about whether text that I was engaged with was generated by AI, is in thinking about the writing is an act, really. Like it's an act of composing, and collaborating isn't just, having more people to get one article done. Collaborating is really super difficult, especially in a writing context. So if you're composing something with other people, that's very human social activity. I think it's probably a community activity. And I think, the same way that I think that it does grammar, it does sentence structure, it does a bunch of stuff so well that you could just let it do it, and then you could focus on the interesting, creative, human pieces of it, that it could be useful in terms of collaboration. It's challenging us to think about how it is that we interact around writing. I know my first year students often talk about, like, I don't have a voice, or I don't hear a voice in this, or you can't hear my voice in this. That voice, it's this kind of nebulous term, right? And we work to give them other terminology to talk about that as a practical matter and as a writer. And talk about their writing, but it's that indelible quality that's missing from these ChatGPT pieces, is that there's nobody there, right? That's put these things together in this particular moment, in this particular way, for this particular audience, in this particular circumstance. And it's not just the text, it's the generating of the text, and not just the language, but the language users to be thinking about.
I would love to stay here and talk more, but it's 4:00, and there are other places that we probably need to be. I do want to thank the panelists I think that we've had an opportunity to get some perspectives from our English faculty colleagues in particular. It's been also wonderful, Anya, to have you with us. Student perspective has really been very helpful throughout these conversations. And this is meant, again, to be this a conversation, not the conversation, not an answer, but just an opportunity, again, to engage in thought. And I encourage you to do that after this panel. Just pick up the phone, have a coffee date with a faculty member, sit down and talk with your students. What's happening? What have you learned about this up to this point in time? Because it is, as we said, not going away. Again, I go back to my favorite quote, that the toothpaste is out of the tube, and we have to kind of learn to adapt with it and work with it. But conversations are super important in that process. I would also draw your attention very quickly. There is another flyer on your table for an upcoming U-Site event dealing with the critical importance of inclusive teaching in higher education. We're delighted to be hosting author Tracy Addy in April at a number of events. Please do check that out. We encourage you to register for campus groups for either of those things. We are super excited that she's going to be joining us. We've referenced her work quite a bit in one of our advancing inclusion, internationalization, diversity, and equity in pedagogical context. So please join us for that and other events that are coming up. And please join me with a warm round of applause for our colleagues and for Anya today. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.